The leather boot came down hard on Samuel Fletcher's foot for the third time in as many minutes, but he didn't so much as flinch as the fiddles sang out across the crowded barn in Genoa, Nevada, on that warm summer evening in 1867. Around them, couples whirled and spun in time with the music, their movements fluid and practiced, while the woman in his arms stumbled through the steps like a newborn calf finding its legs. Her face burned crimson in the lamplight, and he could feel the trembling in her hands as she tried desperately to keep pace with the lively reel. "I'm so sorry," Josephine Foster whispered, for what had to be the 10th time since the dance began. Her voice was barely audible over the music and laughter filling the barn. "I told you I couldn't dance. Everyone warned you." Samuel looked down at her, taking in the mortification written across her delicate features, the way her dark hair had begun to escape its pins from her frantic attempts to follow his lead, and the genuine distress in her brown eyes. He tightened his grip on her waist slightly, steadying her as she nearly lost her balance again. "Then it's a good thing I've got tough feet," he said, his deep voice rumbling with something that might have been amusement. "Don't you worry about it none. We've got all night." The evening had started hours earlier when Samuel rode down from his cabin in the mountains above Genoa. He made the journey into town maybe once a month, sometimes less, only when supplies ran low or when the isolation of the high country became too much even for a man who preferred solitude to society. At 30 years old, he'd spent the better part of a decade living alone, trapping and hunting in the Sierra Nevada, selling his furs and occasionally hiring himself out as a guide for settlers crossing the mountains. His reputation in the small settlement was that of a capable but distant figure, someone folks respected but didn't really know. He'd stopped by the general store first, loading up on flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition. The proprietor, a talkative man named Henderson, had mentioned the barn dance being held that evening to celebrate the successful harvest. Samuel had nodded politely, intending to head back up the mountain before dark, but Henderson had been insistent. "You should come, Fletcher. Might do you good to remember what civilization looks like. Besides, there'll be plenty of food, and Mrs. Henderson made 3 of her apple pies." The mention of home-cooked food had been tempting, Samuel had to admit. His own cooking was functional at best, designed to keep a man alive rather than to provide any enjoyment. He'd found himself agreeing, much to his own surprise, and had taken a room at the boarding house to clean up before the festivities began. The barn belonged to one of the larger ranching families in the area, the Mitchells, and they'd thrown open their doors to the entire community. By the time Samuel arrived, the place was already crowded with miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and their families. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm pools of light across the swept dirt floor. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and at the far end, a group of musicians tuned their instruments. The air smelled of hay, perfume, and the rich aroma of roasted meat. Samuel had immediately felt out of place in his clean but worn buckskins, his shoulder-length dark hair tied back with a leather cord. Most of the other men wore proper shirts and trousers, some even sporting jackets despite the summer heat. He stood a head taller than most of them, his frame heavy with muscle, earned from years of hard physical labor in the mountains. His hands, when he removed his hat, were scarred and calloused, his face weathered by sun and wind. He'd made his way to the food table, filling a plate, when he first heard the voices. A group of young women stood nearby, their heads bent together in conversation punctuated by giggles. He wouldn't have paid them any attention, accustomed as he was to being ignored by polite society, except that their words carried clearly in a momentary lull in the general noise. "Poor Josephine," one of them said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "She's going to spend another dance standing against the wall. No man in his right mind will ask her after what happened at the spring social." "She stepped on Thomas Richardson's feet so many times he limped for a week," another added with a laugh. "And then she practically knocked over Reverend Walsh when she turned the wrong direction." "She just can't dance without stepping on toes," the first woman said. "It's almost sad. Such a pretty face, but completely hopeless when the music starts." Samuel had glanced over then, following their gazes to a young woman standing alone near the barn entrance. She wore a simple but neat dress of dark blue calico, her posture stiff and uncomfortable as she watched the other guests milling about. Her face held a resigned expression, as if she'd already accepted her fate for the evening. Something about that look, The quiet dignity mixed with unmistakable loneliness had struck something deep in Samuel's chest. He'd learned long ago what it felt like to be on the outside, looking in. After his parents died when he was 20, he'd struck out for the territories, unable to bear the pitying looks and empty condolences from neighbors back in Missouri. The mountains had offered solace and escape, but they'd also offered isolation. He saw in this woman's face something he recognized, a kind of enforced solitude that came not from choice, but from circumstances beyond one's control. Before he'd quite realized what he was doing, Samuel found himself crossing the barn floor toward her. She didn't notice his approach at first, too focused on the arriving guests and the general bustle of preparation. When his shadow fell across her, she looked up with a start, her eyes widening as she took in his considerable size. "Evening," he'd said, suddenly feeling awkward and uncertain. Up close, she was even prettier than he'd first thought, with fine features and intelligent eyes. "Name's Samuel Fletcher. Would you care to dance once the music starts?" Josephine had stared at him for a long moment, clearly surprised. Then a series of emotions had crossed her face in rapid succession: pleasure, worry, and finally something like resignation. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Fletcher," she'd said softly, "but I should warn you that I'm not a good dancer. In fact, I'm quite terrible at it. I'd hate to ruin your evening." "You won't," he'd assured her, with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Truth be told, Samuel hadn't danced in years, not since before he'd left Missouri. But he remembered the basics well enough, and more importantly, he couldn't bear the thought of this woman spending the entire evening alone while others whispered about her. She'd hesitated, her fingers twisting together in front of her. "You should know that people have tried to teach me, many times. I just can't seem to get the hang of it. My feet don't go where I want them to, and I lose count of the steps, and I always seem to turn the wrong way at the wrong time." Her voice had grown quieter with each admission, and Samuel had seen the embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Then we'll figure it out together," he'd said simply. "I'm not much of a dancer myself these days. Been living up in the mountains too long, I reckon. Mostly I dance with trees and rocks, and they never complain." That had earned him a small smile, the first he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face entirely. "Well then," she'd said, "I suppose we can't make too much of a spectacle of ourselves, though I make no promises." Her name was Josephine Foster, he'd learned, and she'd come to Genoa 2 years earlier from California with her widowed father. Robert Foster had been a schoolteacher back in Sacramento, but poor health had driven him to seek the drier climate of Nevada. They lived in a small house on the edge of town, where Robert now worked as a bookkeeper for one of the mining operations, while Josephine kept house and took in sewing to supplement their modest income. "Father's lungs were never strong," she'd explained as they'd talked before the dancing began. "The doctor said the mountain air might help, and it has, somewhat. But it means we're far from family, far from the life we knew before. Not that I'm complaining," she'd added quickly. "Genoa has been good to us. The people are kind for the most part." Samuel had caught the qualification in her words, the slight hesitation that spoke of experiences not entirely positive. He'd glanced over at the group of young women who'd been gossiping earlier, now surrounded by eager young men. For the most part, he'd agreed. The musicians had struck up then, and Samuel had offered his arm. Josephine had taken it with visible trepidation, and they'd moved to join the other couples forming sets for the first dance. The moment the music began in earnest, Samuel had understood exactly what Josephine had been trying to warn him about. She had rhythm. He'd give her that, but it seemed to be a rhythm entirely separate from the one the musicians were playing. When she should have stepped forward, she stepped back. When she should have turned left, she turned right. And her feet seemed to find his boots with unerring accuracy, no matter how he tried to guide her. Around them, other couples flowed through the patterns with practiced ease, while Josephine and Samuel lurched and stumbled like salmon swimming upstream. But Samuel kept his word. Each time she stepped on his feet, each time she went the wrong direction, each time she whispered another mortified apology, he simply adjusted his grip, steadied her, and kept going. His expression remained calm and patient, though inwardly he had to admit it was a bit like trying to waltz with a windmill. The woman had determination, he'd give her that much. Despite her obvious discomfort and the stares they were beginning to attract, Josephine kept trying. "You're supposed to go right there," she gasped at one point after she'd gone left and nearly pulled them both off balance. "I'm so sorry, I keep forgetting." "Doesn't matter which way I'm supposed to go," Samuel said, catching her before she could stumble. "I'll follow wherever you lead." "That's not how dancing works," Josephine protested, but there was something almost like laughter in her voice now, mixing with the embarrassment. "Maybe not," Samuel agreed, "but it seems to me we're making our own way just fine." By the second dance, Samuel had developed a strategy. Instead of trying to lead Josephine through the traditional steps, he simplified everything, creating a basic pattern she could follow. Forward, back, side to side. Nothing fancy, nothing that required precise timing or complicated footwork. It meant they looked nothing like the other dancers, but at least they were moving more or less in time with the music, and Josephine had stopped apologizing quite so frequently. The other guests had definitely noticed them by now. Samuel caught more than a few amused glances, heard whispers and poorly concealed laughter. The young women who'd been gossiping earlier watched with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright mockery, but Samuel had spent too many years alone in the wilderness to care much about the opinions of townfolk, and something about the way Josephine kept her chin up despite her flaming cheeks made him angry on her behalf. "They're staring," Josephine murmured during a brief pause in the music. "Everyone's staring at us." "Let them stare," Samuel said. "We're having a good time, aren't we?" Josephine looked up at him then, really looked at him as if trying to determine whether he was serious or simply being kind. Whatever she saw in his face seemed to reassure her because she nodded slowly. "I suppose we are," she said, sounding faintly surprised. "I mean, I'm still stepping all over your poor feet, but you're not limping away in horror, so that's an improvement over last time." "My feet have survived bear traps and rattlesnake bites," Samuel told her. "They can handle a few dance steps." That earned him another one of those transformative smiles, and Samuel felt something shift in his chest. There was something deeply appealing about this woman, beyond her pretty face. She had spirit, perseverance, and a self-deprecating humor that spoke of someone who'd learned to laugh at herself rather than be defeated by her shortcomings. In his experience, that kind of resilience was rare and valuable. The evening wore on, and Samuel danced with Josephine through every song. Other men occasionally approached, either to cut in or to ask Josephine for a dance, but Samuel found himself reluctant to relinquish his partner, and Josephine seemed equally content to stay where she was. They'd fallen into an odd sort of rhythm now, not graceful by any stretch of the imagination, but functional. Josephine still stepped on his feet regularly, still went the wrong direction more often than not, but there was an ease between them now, a comfort that came from mutual understanding. During one break in the music, while the musicians rested and refreshed themselves, Josephine and Samuel stepped outside for some air. The night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant in the Nevada sky. From inside the barn came the sounds of laughter and conversation, but out here it was relatively quiet. "Thank you," Josephine said after a moment of comfortable silence. "For tonight, I mean. You didn't have to spend the entire evening dancing with the town's most hopeless case, but you did, and I appreciate it more than I can say." Samuel leaned against the barn wall, looking down at her in the starlight. "You're not a hopeless case," he said firmly. "You just moved to your own music is all. Nothing wrong with that." "That's a very generous interpretation of my complete lack of coordination," Josephine said with a slight laugh. "But I'll take it." She paused, seeming to gather her courage for something. "Can I ask why you did it? Asked me to dance, I mean. You don't know me, and I'm sure you heard what people say." Samuel considered the question, trying to put his instinctive reaction into words. "I heard what they said," he confirmed. "That's part of why I asked. Seemed wrong, leaving you standing alone while folks made sport of you. Besides," he added after a moment, "I know what it's like to not quite fit in where you are." "The mountain man," Josephine said softly. "I've heard of you, Samuel Fletcher. They say you live up in the high country, that you can track anything, that you're tougher than the granite peaks you call home. They also say you don't much care for people." "The last part's not entirely true," Samuel said. "I don't much care for crowds or for folks who spend their time tearing others down. But people themselves? Some of them are fine enough." "Present company included?" Josephine asked, a teasing note in her voice. "Present company especially," Samuel said, and was rewarded by seeing her blush again, though from pleasure this time rather than embarrassment. They'd gone back inside then, and Samuel had claimed her for another dance. This time, as they moved through their simplified steps, Josephine seemed more relaxed, less concerned about doing everything perfectly. She still stepped on his feet, but she'd stopped apologizing for it, and once or twice Samuel could have sworn he heard her humming along with the music. As the night deepened, the crowd began to thin. Families with small children departed first, followed by the older couples. The musicians showed no signs of tiring, however, and a core group of dancers remained, determined to enjoy the festivities until dawn if possible. Samuel and Josephine stayed among them, lost in their own private world of awkward steps and growing connection. It was during a slow waltz, when the fiddles played something sweet and melancholy, that Samuel felt Josephine relax completely against him. Her hand on his shoulder grew heavier, trusting, and her steps, while still imperfect, began to match his own with more accuracy than they had all evening. She was learning him, he realized, learning the way he moved, the way he signaled his intentions through pressure and stance rather than through traditional dance positions. "You know," Josephine said quietly, her voice nearly lost in the music, "when I woke up this morning, I had no intention of coming tonight. I've avoided these dances for months now, ever since the incident at the spring social. But Father insisted. He said I couldn't hide forever, that I needed to face people and hold my head up. I was angry with him for pushing me." "And now?" Samuel asked. "Now I'm glad he did," Josephine said, looking up at him, "because if he hadn't, I wouldn't have met you." The simple honesty of her words hit Samuel harder than any physical blow could have. In the mountains, he'd grown accustomed to his own company, had convinced himself that solitude was what he wanted, what he needed. But standing here with Josephine Foster in his arms, feeling the warmth of her against him, seeing the genuine affection in her eyes, Samuel realized he'd been lying to himself for a very long time. "Josephine," he started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "Miss Foster, I mean." "Josephine is fine," she said softly. "I think we're past formalities, don't you? You've let me step on your feet for hours now. That creates a certain intimacy." Samuel smiled at that, a real smile that felt rusty from disuse, but genuine. "I suppose it does. Josephine, then, I was wondering if I might call on you sometime. When I'm next in town, I mean. If that would be acceptable." He could see the pleasure bloom across her face like sunrise over the mountains. "I would like that very much," she said. "Father and I live in the small white house past the church, the one with the blue shutters. You'd be welcome any time." They danced the rest of that waltz in silence, but it was a comfortable silence now, filled with possibilities and unspoken promises. When the song ended and another lively reel began, Samuel led Josephine back into the simplified pattern they'd established, and this time, when she stepped on his feet, she laughed outright, the sound bright and uninhibited. The barn dance continued until nearly 3 in the morning, when even the most enthusiastic dancers had to admit defeat. As people began to disperse, collecting sleeping children and empty dishes, Samuel walked Josephine home through the quiet streets of Genoa. The night air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the surrounding mountains. At her door, Josephine turned to face him, her expression serious now. "Samuel, I need you to understand something. I really am terrible at dancing. Tonight wasn't a fluke or bad luck. I've had lessons, I've practiced, and I still can't manage it. If you're hoping I'll improve, you're likely to be disappointed." Samuel looked down at her, this woman who'd somehow worked her way past his defenses in the span of a single evening. "I don't need you to improve," he said firmly. "I like you exactly as you are. Dancing skills or lack thereof don't change that." "You say that now," Josephine said, but she was smiling. "Wait until I've stepped on your feet a few dozen more times. Then I'll look forward to it," Samuel said, and meant it. He saw her safely inside, waited until he heard the bolt slide home, then made his way back to the boarding house. His feet did hurt, he had to admit, and there would likely be some impressive bruises by morning. But Samuel couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this alive, this connected to another human being. As he fell asleep in the narrow boarding house bed, his last thought was of brown eyes and a bright laugh, and the feeling of a woman trusting enough to lean against him despite her own uncertainty. 3 days later, Samuel returned to Genoa. He'd told himself he needed additional supplies, that he'd forgotten to purchase enough tobacco, But the truth was he couldn't get Josephine out of his mind. He found himself thinking about her as he checked his trap lines, as he chopped wood for his cabin, as he watched the sun set over the mountains. The solitude he'd once cherished now felt empty, hollow in a way it never had before. The white house with blue shutters stood on a slight rise at the edge of town, with a small garden out front where vegetables grew in neat rows. Samuel approached with uncharacteristic nervousness, suddenly uncertain of his welcome in the daylight, away from the magical atmosphere of the barn dance. But when he knocked, Josephine herself answered, and the way her face lit up at the sight of him erased any doubts. "Samuel," she said, clearly pleased. "I wasn't expecting to see you so soon. Not that I'm complaining," she added quickly. "Please come in." The house was small but immaculately kept, with simple furniture and lace curtains at the windows. Books lined makeshift shelves on every available wall, and the air smelled of fresh bread and lavender. An older man sat in a rocking chair near the fireplace, a blanket across his lap despite the summer warmth. He looked up as Samuel entered, and his thin face broke into a welcoming smile. "Father, this is Samuel Fletcher," Josephine said. "Samuel, my father, Robert Foster." Robert stood, moving slowly but with dignity, and extended his hand. Samuel shook it carefully, aware of how much larger and stronger his own hand was. "Mr. Fletcher," Robert said, his voice cultured and warm, "Josephine has told me about you, about the barn dance and your considerable patience. I understand I owe you thanks for ensuring my daughter had a pleasant evening." "No thanks necessary, sir," Samuel said. "The pleasure was mine." "Please sit," Robert gestured to another chair. "Josephine, perhaps some of that fresh bread and jam. I'm sure Mr. Fletcher would appreciate refreshment after riding down from the mountains." Over bread and coffee, Samuel found himself relaxing into conversation with both Fosters. Robert was an educated man, well-read and thoughtful, and despite his obvious ill health, his mind was sharp and engaged. They talked of books, of California and Missouri, of the challenges and beauties of the Nevada territory. Josephine moved between the kitchen and the sitting room, contributing to the conversation, while also managing to prepare a full lunch that she insisted Samuel stay for. It was over that lunch that Samuel began to understand the bond between father and daughter. Robert clearly doted on Josephine and she on him, but there was also a deep respect between them, a meeting of minds and mutual appreciation. They finished each other's sentences, shared private jokes, and moved around each other with the practiced ease of people who'd learned to function as a complete unit. "Josephine worries about me too much," Robert said at one point, when his daughter had gone to fetch more water. "She spends too much time caring for an invalid old man and not enough living her own life." "You're neither invalid nor old," Samuel said, "and it seems to me she's living exactly the life she wants." "Perhaps," Robert allowed, "but a father wishes to see his daughter settled, happy with a family of her own someday. Instead, she's tied to a sick man in a remote town where she doesn't quite belong." Samuel heard the worry beneath the words, the guilt and frustration. "She belongs wherever she chooses to be," he said firmly. "And from what I can see, she chooses to be here, with you. That's not a sacrifice. That's love." Robert studied him for a long moment, something like approval in his eyes. "You're a perceptive man, Mr. Fletcher, more so than your reputation suggests. Please, call me Samuel. And reputations rarely tell the whole story." When Josephine returned, Samuel asked if she might like to take a walk with him. Robert waved them off with obvious pleasure, settling back into his chair with a book. Josephine collected a shawl and bonnet, and they set out together into the bright afternoon. They walked the outskirts of town, following a path that led toward the foothills. Samuel found himself telling her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he'd built with his own hands, about the wildlife he encountered, and the challenges of surviving in such a remote location. Josephine listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions that showed she was really hearing him, not just being polite. In turn, she told him more about her life in California, about the school where her father had taught, about her mother who died when Josephine was just 15, about the difficult decision to leave everything familiar and move to Nevada for Robert's health. "It was frightening," she admitted, "starting over in a place where we knew no one, where everything was strange and rough compared to Sacramento, but it was also exciting in a way, an adventure." "Do you miss California?" Samuel asked. Josephine considered the question. "Sometimes. I miss the ocean, the sound of it at night. I miss having family nearby, cousins and aunts who I grew up with. But Genoa has become home. The landscape here is beautiful in its own harsh way, and the people, despite their occasional tendency toward gossip, are fundamentally good." "Except when they're making fun of your dancing," Samuel said. Josephine laughed. "Well, yes, there is that. But can I tell you a secret? I don't actually mind the teasing as much as people probably think I do. It's all true after all. I really am hopeless at dancing. What bothers me more is the isolation it creates, the feeling of being set apart. That's what hurt about not being asked to dance, not the confirmation that I lack grace, but the reminder that I don't quite fit in." Samuel understood that feeling all too well. "I spent years telling myself I preferred being alone," he said. "Convinced myself that other people were more trouble than they were worth, that I was better off in the mountains with just my own company. But lately I've been wondering if maybe I was just afraid. If maybe it's easier to be alone by choice than to risk being alone because nobody wants you around." Josephine stopped walking and turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful and kind. "I don't think you need to worry about that," she said softly. "About nobody wanting you around, I mean. I want you around. Very much." The simple declaration hit Samuel right in the center of his chest. He reached out, taking her hand in his, and was relieved when she didn't pull away. "I want to be around," he said. "Here with you. I know it's fast, we barely know each other, but Josephine, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the dance." "I haven't stopped thinking about you either," Josephine admitted, her fingers tightening around his. "Which is probably terribly improper of me to admit, but there it is." They stood like that for a long moment, hands clasped, looking at each other in the bright sunlight. Then Samuel, moving slowly to give her time to pull away if she wanted, leaned down and kissed her gently. It was a brief kiss, chaste and careful, but it felt like a promise, like the beginning of something important. When they broke apart, Josephine was blushing but smiling. "Well," she said, sounding slightly breathless, "that was nice." "Better than nice," Samuel said, and kissed her again. Over the following weeks, Samuel found himself making the journey down from his cabin more frequently than he ever had before. He'd spend a day or two in Genoa, calling on Josephine, helping Robert with small repairs around their house, integrating himself gradually into their lives. He discovered that Robert had a sharp wit and a love of chess, and many evenings found them bent over a chessboard while Josephine sewed or read nearby, occasionally interjecting commentary on their game. He also discovered that Josephine's lack of dancing ability extended to a general clumsiness that manifested in endearing ways. She knocked over water glasses, tripped over perfectly flat ground, and once managed to get her sewing needle stuck in her hair in a way that required his assistance to extract. But she also had a brilliant mind, a quick sense of humor, and a capacity for joy that Samuel found intoxicating. "How do you manage it?" he asked her one day, after she'd dropped an entire basket of apples that then had to be chased down as they rolled across the yard. "How do you stay so cheerful when the universe seems determined to make simple tasks complicated for you?" Josephine laughed, brushing dirt from one of the rescued apples. "Because if I didn't laugh, I'd cry, and that seems like a waste of time. Besides, it makes life interesting, don't you think? Other people have boring, predictable days. I never know what minor catastrophe awaits me around the next corner." Samuel helped her collect the last of the apples, then pulled her into his arms, right there in the yard, where any neighbor might see. "You're remarkable," he told her seriously. "Do you know that?" "I'm really not," Josephine protested, but she was glowing from the compliment. "I'm just stubbornly optimistic." "That's what makes you remarkable," Samuel insisted, and kissed her soundly. Their courtship became the talk of Genoa, though the gossip was mostly good-natured now. People seemed charmed by the unlikely pairing of the rough mountain man and the clumsy but sweet-natured girl. The same young women who'd mocked Josephine at the barn dance now watched with something like envy, as Samuel, clearly besotted, followed her around town carrying her packages and treating her like precious cargo. There was one incident, however, that threatened their budding happiness. It happened about 2 months into their courtship, at another town gathering, this one a picnic by the river to celebrate the 4th of July. Samuel had come down from the mountains specifically for the event, and he and Josephine had spread a blanket under a cottonwood tree, joining other couples and families in the festivities. Everything had been pleasant until Thomas Richardson, the man who'd complained about Josephine stepping on his feet at a previous dance, approached with a group of his friends. Thomas was the son of a successful mine owner, used to getting his way, and he'd had too much whiskey despite the early hour. "Well, if it isn't our clumsy little Josephine," Thomas said, his words slightly slurred. "Still stepping all over people, I imagine. How are your feet holding up, Fletcher? She hasn't crippled you yet?" Samuel stood slowly, unfolding to his full, impressive height. His expression remained calm, but there was something dangerous in his eyes. "I think you should move along, Richardson," he said quietly. "Oh, come now," Thomas persisted, emboldened by alcohol and the presence of his friends. "We're all friends here. I'm just wondering what you see in her. Pretty enough face, I'll grant you, but clumsy as an ox and about as graceful. You could do better, mountain man." The insult hung in the air, and Samuel felt rage building in his chest. His hands clenched into fists, and he took a step toward Thomas. But before he could do anything he might regret, Josephine was there, placing herself between him and Thomas with surprising speed. "That's enough," she said firmly, looking up at Thomas without fear. "You've had too much to drink and you're embarrassing yourself. I suggest you take Samuel's advice and leave before you make this worse." Thomas looked down at her, clearly surprised by her direct confrontation. Then he laughed, though it sounded forced. "Defending your man, are you? That's rich, coming from someone who can't walk across a room without causing damage." "Better clumsy than cruel," Josephine shot back. "Better to knock over a few things accidentally than to deliberately hurt people with ugly words because you're too drunk and insecure to behave like a gentleman. Now go away, Thomas. You're not welcome here." For a moment, Samuel thought Thomas might argue, might push the confrontation further. But something in Josephine's steady gaze seemed to deflate him. He muttered something uncomplimentary under his breath, but he turned and walked away, his friends following after casting apologetic glances back at Josephine and Samuel. Once they were gone, Samuel pulled Josephine close, his heart still pounding with residual anger. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I could have handled him." "I know you could have," Josephine said, leaning against his chest. "That's why I stepped in. You could have handled him, and probably would have broken his nose in the process, and then you'd have been the one who looked bad, when all you were doing was defending me. I couldn't let that happen." Samuel held her tighter, overwhelmed by the realization that this woman, who so many people dismissed as clumsy and awkward, was actually one of the strongest people he'd ever met. "I love you," he said, the words emerging without conscious thought. "Josephine, I love you." She pulled back just enough to look up at him, tears shining in her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to say it." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid you'd realize you could do better," she admitted. "Afraid you'd wake up one day and wonder what you were thinking, courting the town's most hopeless case." Samuel cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. "You listen to me, Josephine Foster. You're not hopeless. You're not clumsy. You're not whatever other unkind things people have said about you. You're brave and kind and funny and beautiful, and I'm the luckiest man in Nevada that you're letting me court you. Do you understand?" Josephine nodded, tears spilling over now, but they were happy tears. "I understand," she said. "And Samuel, you're not a rough, unsociable mountain man who doesn't care about people. You're gentle and patient, and you have the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. And I'm the luckiest woman in Nevada that you walked into that barn dance and asked me to dance." They kissed then, there under the cottonwood tree with the sounds of celebration around them, and Samuel felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness and home that he'd never expected to find again. This woman, who couldn't dance without stepping on toes, who knocked over water glasses and tripped on smooth ground, who faced the world with humor and courage despite being mocked for things beyond her control, this woman was his future. He knew it with absolute certainty. That evening, after the fireworks and festivities concluded, Samuel asked to speak with Robert privately. They sat on the porch of the White House with blue shutters, and Samuel got straight to the point. "Mr. Foster, Robert, I'd like your permission to marry Josephine. I love her, and I believe she loves me, and I want to spend the rest of my life with her." Robert was quiet for a long moment, and Samuel felt anxiety twist in his gut. Then the older man smiled. "I was wondering when you'd ask," he said. "You have my blessing, Samuel, enthusiastically so. I've watched the two of you together these past months, and I've seen how happy you make each other. That's all any father could want for his daughter." "There's something you should know," Samuel continued, "about my life, about what I do. I live in the mountains, Robert. It's not an easy life, and it's isolated. If Josephine agrees to marry me, I'd want her with me, in my cabin, but that would mean leaving you here alone, and I know how much you need each other. I've been thinking about it, trying to figure out how to make it work." Robert held up a hand. "Samuel, I appreciate your consideration, but you needn't worry. I've been thinking about this too, anticipating it. My health has actually improved considerably since we moved to Nevada. The dry air, as the doctors predicted, has been good for my lungs. I'm not the invalid I was when we first arrived. I can manage on my own, and there are people in town who've offered to check in on me regularly." "Even so," Samuel said, "I don't like the idea of you being alone. What if something happened? What if you needed help?" "Then I would get help," Robert said gently. "Samuel, you're a good man, and I love that you care about my welfare. But Josephine has spent 2 years putting her life on hold to care for me. 2 years of sacrifice and devotion when she should have been meeting people her own age, building her own future. I won't be the reason she loses her chance at happiness now. And before you suggest it, no, I don't want you two staying in town for my sake. You belong in those mountains, Samuel. I've seen the way you talk about them, the peace you find there. And Josephine, for all that she came from the city, has always loved nature, loved solitude and beauty. You'll be good for each other." Samuel felt relief wash over him, mixed with deep respect for this man who was willing to be alone rather than hold his daughter back. "Thank you," he said simply. "I promise I'll take good care of her." "I know you will," Robert said. "And Samuel, for what it's worth, I think Josephine will take good care of you too. You've been alone a long time. It's good to see you letting someone in." The proposal itself happened a week later in a location Samuel had chosen with care. He'd taken Josephine on a ride up into the mountains, higher than she'd been before, to a meadow filled with wildflowers and ringed by granite peaks. A stream ran through it, clear and cold, and the air smelled of pine and sage. It was one of Samuel's favorite places, a spot he came to when he needed to think or to remember why he'd chosen this life. "It's beautiful," Josephine breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "Samuel, this is extraordinary." "This is my world," Samuel said, coming to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "This is what I see every day, what I wake up to, what I live in. And Josephine, I want to share it with you. All of it. Forever." He felt her stiffen slightly in his arms, sensed that she understood what he was about to say. He turned her gently to face him, then dropped to one knee, pulling a small ring from his pocket. It wasn't much, just a simple gold band with a single small stone, but he'd spent his last trip to Carson City searching for it, wanting something worthy of her. "Josephine Foster," he said, looking up at her, "will you marry me? Will you come up here to the mountains and be my wife? I know it's not an easy life. I know you'll be far from town and from your father, but I swear to you I'll do everything in my power to make you happy. I'll keep you safe and warm, I'll provide for you, and I'll love you with everything I have for as long as I live." Josephine was crying again, her hands covering her mouth, and for a terrible moment Samuel thought she might refuse. Then she dropped to her knees in front of him, heedless of her dress in the grass, and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes," she said through her tears. "Yes, Samuel, yes, I'll marry you. I want nothing more than to share your life, your mountains, your world." "Yes." Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her with all the pent-up emotion of the past months. They stayed there in the meadow for hours, making plans, talking about the future, simply being together in the place that would become their home. Josephine asked about the cabin, about how she could help improve it, about whether there was space for a garden. Samuel told her about the winters, wanting to be honest about how harsh they could be, how isolated they would become when the snows came. She listened to all of it and remained undaunted. "As long as we're together," she said simply, "I can handle anything." They were married 6 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Genoa. Josephine wore a dress of white muslin that she'd sewn herself, with tiny blue flowers embroidered around the hem. Samuel wore new clothes purchased specifically for the occasion, though he felt stiff and uncomfortable in the formal attire. Robert gave his daughter away with tears in his eyes, but a smile on his face, and the gathering of townsfolk who attended seemed genuinely happy for the couple. The reception afterward was held in the same barn where they'd first danced together. The musicians played, the tables groaned under the weight of contributed food, and when it came time for the traditional first dance, Samuel led his new wife onto the floor with confidence. Josephine, true to form, immediately stepped on his feet. "Some things never change," she whispered, laughing and apologizing at the same time. "Thank God for that," Samuel replied, and meant it with all his heart. They danced together through song after song, creating their own awkward pattern just as they had that first night. Other couples joined them, and while Samuel and Josephine were by far the least graceful dancers there, no one made unkind comments. Instead, people seemed charmed by their obvious devotion, by the way Samuel looked at his new wife as if she hung the stars, by the way Josephine relaxed in his arms despite her dancing deficiencies. It was late in the evening when an older woman, Mrs. Henderson from the general store, approached Josephine during a break in the music. Samuel was nearby talking with Robert, but he could hear their conversation clearly. "Mrs. Fletcher," Mrs. Henderson said warmly, using Josephine's new name, "I wanted to apologize to you for the things I've said in the past, for the gossip I spread. It was unkind of me, and watching you and your husband tonight, seeing how happy you both are, I'm ashamed of myself." Josephine looked surprised but pleased. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That's very gracious of you to say." "You're a lovely young woman," Mrs. Henderson continued, "and you've found yourself a good man. He let you step on his feet all night long that first dance, and he didn't complain once. That's love, pure and simple. And anyone who doesn't see that is a fool." After the woman walked away, Josephine came over to Samuel, slipping her hand into his. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "I did," Samuel confirmed. "People can surprise you," Josephine said thoughtfully. "Just when you think you have them figured out, they go and do something decent." "Speaking of decent," Samuel said, "your father wants us to stay in town tonight, says it's foolish to try to make it up the mountain in the dark, but I told him we'd be fine. Unless you want to stay?" Josephine looked around at the celebration, at the people laughing and dancing, at her father talking with neighbors near the food table. Then she looked up at Samuel, her husband, this man who'd changed her life so completely in such a short time. "I want to go home," she said. "Our home. Take me to the mountains, Samuel." They left shortly after, riding double on Samuel's horse with their few belongings packed on a mule behind them. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate the trail, and Samuel knew the path so well he could have made it blindfolded. Josephine sat in front of him, wrapped in his arms, leaning back against his chest. She was quiet for most of the journey, and Samuel let her be, understanding that she was probably thinking about her father, about the life she was leaving behind. They reached the cabin just before midnight. It was a solid structure, built of logs Samuel had cut and hauled himself, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The single room inside was simply furnished but clean, with a bed in one corner, a table and chairs, shelves for supplies, and the fireplace dominating one wall. It wasn't much compared to what some people might expect, but Samuel had made sure to prepare it as best he could for bringing home a wife. "It's perfect," Josephine said, looking around with genuine pleasure. "Samuel, it's absolutely perfect." Over the following months, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Josephine proved to be adaptable and resourceful, learning to cook over the fireplace, to preserve food for winter, to help with the endless tasks required to survive in such a remote location. She was, as Samuel had known she would be, occasionally clumsy about it. She burned dinners, spilled supplies, and once nearly started a small fire by knocking over a lantern. But she tackled each challenge with humor and determination, and Samuel found himself falling more in love with her every day. He taught her to identify animal tracks, to predict weather by reading the sky, to move quietly through the forest. She taught him to appreciate books again, reading aloud to him in the evenings by firelight, to think before reacting, to express his feelings instead of bottling them up inside. They complemented each other perfectly, two people who'd been incomplete alone, but who together formed something whole and strong. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in late October. Samuel had worried about how Josephine would handle the isolation, the bitter cold, the endless white landscape that made everything look the same. But she thrived in it, bundling up in the furs he'd provided and venturing out to help him with the trap lines, marveling at the beauty of ice-covered trees and frozen waterfalls. It was on one of these winter expeditions that disaster nearly struck. They'd been checking traps in a ravine about 2 miles from the cabin when Josephine, never the most coordinated person, slipped on a patch of ice. She fell hard, sliding several feet down the slope before Samuel managed to catch her. But the damage was done. When he helped her up, she couldn't put weight on her left ankle without gasping in pain. "It's fine," she insisted, though tears streamed down her face. "Just twisted. I can walk." "Like hell you can," Samuel said, his heart pounding with fear and self-recrimination. He should never have brought her out here, should have been more careful, should have anticipated the danger. "Josephine, you might have broken it." "I don't think it's broken," she said through gritted teeth. "But I don't think I can walk on it either. Samuel, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Don't you dare apologize," Samuel said fiercely. He swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest. "Hold on to me. I'm going to get you home." The 2-mile journey back to the cabin was one of the longest of Samuel's life. Josephine tried to stay quiet, but he could feel her shaking with pain, could hear her occasional whimpers despite her efforts to stay silent. His own fear manifested as anger at himself for bringing her out here, anger at the ice, at the mountains, at his own helplessness in the face of her injury. Back at the cabin, Samuel set her gently on the bed and examined her ankle as carefully as he could. It was already swelling badly, but when he probed it gently, nothing felt obviously broken. A severe sprain, he thought, or hoped. He wrapped it tightly, elevated it on folded blankets, and made Josephine as comfortable as possible. "You should go get a doctor," Josephine said, her face pale with pain. "Ride down to Genoa and bring back help." Samuel looked out the window at the heavily falling snow. "Can't," he said flatly. "Storm's getting worse. I'd never make it down the mountain tonight. And even if I did, no doctor could get back up here until the weather clears. You're stuck with me, I'm afraid." "I'm not afraid," Josephine said, reaching for his hand. "Samuel, I trust you. If anyone can take care of me, it's you." Over the next several days, Samuel barely left her side. He kept the fire burning, made broth and hot tea, changed the wrappings on her ankle, and monitored her constantly for signs of infection or complications. Josephine endured it all with the same courage and humor she brought to everything, even managing to joke about adding injuring herself on ice to her list of accomplishments. "You have to admit," she said one evening, "I'm nothing if not consistent. Can't dance without stepping on toes, can't walk on ice without falling. If there's a clumsy way to do something, I'll find it." "Your ankle is hurt because the ice was slippery," Samuel said firmly, "not because you're clumsy. Anyone could have fallen there." "But it was me who did," Josephine pointed out, "as usual." Samuel sat on the edge of the bed, taking her hand carefully. "Josephine, I need you to listen to me. The fact that you sometimes knock things over or trip on smooth ground, that doesn't make you less. It doesn't make you deficient or broken. It just makes you human. We all have things we're not good at, things that don't come easily. Yours are just more visible, that's all. But your life would be easier if I wasn't like this," Josephine said softly. "If you'd married someone more capable, more coordinated. My life would be empty if I'd married anyone but you." Samuel said with absolute conviction, "Do you understand that? Josephine, you're the bravest, strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. You came up here to the middle of nowhere, to a rough cabin miles from civilization, and you've thrived. You've made this place a home. You've made my life worth living. And if the price of having you is occasionally catching you when you trip or wrapping your ankle when you fall on ice, then I'll pay that price gladly every single day for the rest of my life." Josephine was crying now, but smiling through the tears. "You always know exactly what to say," she whispered. "How do you do that?" "I just tell the truth," Samuel said, and kissed her forehead gently. "Now rest. Your ankle needs time to heal." It took nearly 3 weeks for Josephine to fully recover, 3 weeks during which Samuel proved just how capable he was at nursing. By the time she could walk without pain, she'd gained a new appreciation for his gentle patience, for the way he cared for her without making her feel helpless or burdensome. And Samuel, for his part, had learned that loving someone meant accepting their vulnerabilities, protecting them without diminishing their strength. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. Samuel continued his work trapping and occasionally guiding travelers through the mountains, while Josephine established a garden near the cabin, canned and preserved food, and created a home that Samuel had never imagined he'd have. They made the journey down to Genoa monthly to visit Robert, who'd remained healthy and had even begun courting a widow in town, to Samuel and Josephine's mutual delight. It was on one of these visits, in late summer of 1868, that Josephine announced she was pregnant. Samuel had suspected for a few weeks, noticing small changes in her, but hearing her say the words made it real in a way that took his breath away. They told Robert together, and the older man's joy was so profound, it brought tears to everyone's eyes. "A grandchild," Robert said wonderingly. "Josephine, Samuel, this is wonderful news. When?" "Early spring, the doctor thinks," Josephine said, her hand resting protectively on her still flat stomach, "which means we have all winter to prepare." Samuel felt excitement and terror in equal measure. A child, his child, Josephine's child, coming into the world in the remote mountain cabin. The dangers were obvious and numerous. What if something went wrong? What if Josephine needed help he couldn't provide? What if the baby came early during a blizzard when getting down the mountain was impossible? Josephine, sensing his worry, squeezed his hand. "We'll be fine," she said firmly. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time in all kinds of circumstances, and I'll have you. That's all I need." "I think you should stay in town for the winter," Samuel said. "Stay with your father. Be near the doctor. It would be safer." "Absolutely not," Josephine said. "Samuel, I'm not leaving you alone in the mountains for months. We're a family now. We stay together." They argued about it, the first real disagreement of their marriage. Samuel was adamant that safety should be their primary concern. Josephine was equally adamant that separating for months would be worse than any potential danger. In the end, they reached a compromise. Josephine would stay in the cabin through most of the winter, but when her time drew near, they would make the journey to Genoa, staying with Robert for the birth and the first few weeks after. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Josephine's inherent clumsiness became slightly worse as her balance shifted and her belly grew. She knocked over more things than usual, had trouble navigating the narrow spaces in the cabin, and once nearly fell off the porch trying to carry too many logs for the fireplace. Samuel became hypervigilant, constantly hovering, catching her before she could stumble, moving obstacles out of her path. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Josephine protested after he'd caught her for the third time in a single day. "I know," Samuel said, "but you're carrying precious cargo, and I'll be damned if anything happens to either of you because I wasn't paying attention." Despite his worries, winter passed peacefully. They spent long evenings by the fire, Samuel with his hand resting on Josephine's belly feeling the baby kick, Josephine reading or working on tiny garments for their coming child. They talked about names, about how they would teach their son or daughter to love the mountains as they did, about the future stretching out before them full of possibility. In late February, as they'd planned, Samuel loaded their supplies and helped Josephine onto his horse for the journey to Genoa. The trip down was slow and careful, but they made it safely, and Robert welcomed them with tears in his eyes and a house prepared for their arrival. The doctor examined Josephine and pronounced her healthy and likely to deliver within a few weeks. Samuel settled into the strange experience of being in town for an extended period, helping Robert with various tasks, making sure Josephine was comfortable, and trying not to pace too obviously. The baby came on a cold March morning, arriving after a night of labor that Samuel found far more agonizing than Josephine seemed to. He stayed with her throughout, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, offering whatever comfort and support he could. When the baby's first cry filled the small bedroom, Samuel felt something break open in his chest, a well of emotion so profound he couldn't speak. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, wrapping the infant in a soft blanket and placing him in Josephine's arms. "Congratulations, you two. He's perfect." Samuel looked down at his wife and son, at this miracle they'd created together, and felt his vision blur with tears. Josephine was exhausted, her hair plastered to her head with sweat, but she'd never looked more beautiful. And the baby, tiny and red-faced and squalling, was the most perfect thing Samuel had ever seen. "Simon," Josephine said softly, looking up at Samuel. "Can we call him Simon? Simon Robert Fletcher?" "Simon," Samuel repeated, testing the name. It felt right, solid, and strong. A good name for a boy who would grow up in the mountains. "Simon Robert Fletcher. I like it." Robert, who'd been waiting anxiously in the other room, was invited in to meet his grandson. The older man's face when he saw the baby was something Samuel would remember forever. A mixture of joy and wonder, and love so pure it transcended words. They stayed in Genoa for 6 weeks, letting Josephine recover and Simon grow strong enough for the journey up the mountain. It was a precious time, watching Robert bond with his grandson, seeing Josephine blossom into motherhood, learning how to be a father himself. Samuel discovered he had a natural talent for soothing a crying infant, his deep voice and steady presence seeming to comfort Simon in a way that delighted Josephine. "He knows you," she said one evening, watching Samuel walk the floor with their son nestled against his broad chest. "He knows he's safe with you." "He'll always be safe with me," Samuel promised. "Both of you. I'll protect you with everything I have." When they finally made the journey back to their cabin, Simon bundled carefully in furs. Samuel felt like his life had come full circle. He'd left Missouri years ago running from loss and pain, had hidden himself in these mountains thinking solitude was what he needed. But Josephine had shown him a different truth. He didn't need to be alone to be whole. He needed connection, love, family. He needed her, and now their son. The years that followed were full and rich. Simon grew strong and healthy, becoming a sturdy, adventurous child who inherited his father's love of the mountains and his mother's cheerful disposition. Samuel taught him to track, to fish, to respect the wilderness and its creatures. Josephine taught him to read, to think, to be kind and gentle even as he grew strong. When Simon was 3, they were blessed with a daughter they named Grace. She had Josephine's brown eyes and Samuel's dark hair, and from birth she seemed determined to follow her mother's pattern of beautiful clumsiness. She knocked over her first cup of milk before she could even walk properly, and Josephine and Samuel shared knowing smiles over her head. "She's just like me," Josephine said with a laugh, cleaning up the spill. "Poor thing." "Lucky thing," Samuel corrected, pulling his wife close. "She gets to be just like the most amazing woman I know." Robert remained healthy for several more years, long enough to know both his grandchildren, to watch Simon start learning his letters, to hold Grace as an infant. He passed peacefully in his sleep in 1872, and though his loss was deeply felt, there was comfort in knowing he'd lived to see his daughter happy, settled, with a family of her own. Samuel and Josephine continued to thrive in their mountain home. They added rooms to the cabin as their family grew, built a proper barn for animals, expanded the garden. Every few months they'd host visitors from town, people who'd made the trek up to see how the unlikely couple was doing, who'd spread word back in Genoa that the mountain man and his clumsy bride were not just surviving but flourishing. And every so often, when they made trips down to town for supplies or celebrations, there would be a dance. Invariably, Samuel would lead Josephine onto the floor, and just as invariably, she would step on his feet throughout the entire song. It became something of a tradition, something the townspeople watched for with fond amusement rather than mockery. "She still can't dance," someone would observe. "And he still lets her step on his feet all night long," someone else would reply. "That's love," a third voice would add, usually with a wistful sigh. And it was love, pure and simple and true. Love that had started with a simple act of kindness in a crowded barn, with a man choosing compassion over judgment, with a woman brave enough to try despite knowing she would fail. Love that had grown and deepened through shared experiences, through challenges overcome, through the simple act of choosing each other every single day. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel and Josephine stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset behind the mountains. Simon and Grace were inside, playing some elaborate game that involved much laughter and occasional crashes as Grace bumped into furniture. Samuel had his arm around Josephine's shoulders, her head resting against his chest, and they were both quiet content in the peaceful evening. "Do you ever regret it?" Josephine asked suddenly. "Marrying me? Taking on all my clumsiness and chaos?" Samuel looked down at her, surprised. "Never," he said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Why would you even ask that?" "Because I know your life would be easier without me knocking things over all the time," Josephine said. "Without me falling on ice or stepping on your feet or teaching our daughter to be just as clumsy as I am." Samuel turned her to face him, his large hands gentle on her shoulders. "My life would be emptier without you," he said. "Easier doesn't mean better. I'd rather have chaos and laughter and knocked over water glasses with you than perfect silence and order alone. You've given me everything, Josephine. A home, a family, a reason to wake up smiling every morning. The fact that you sometimes trip over your own feet is just part of who you are, and I love who you are. All of it." Josephine smiled up at him, that bright, transformative smile that had captured his heart 10 years earlier. "I love you too," she said, "even though you never complain when I step on your feet during dances, which probably encourages me to keep doing it." "I hope you keep doing it forever," Samuel said, and meant it. "In fact, I'm counting on it." From inside came the sound of something crashing, followed by Grace's cheerful voice announcing she was fine. Samuel and Josephine looked at each other and laughed, the sound carrying out across the mountains. Samuel called home, the mountains he shared with the woman who couldn't dance without stepping on toes, the woman he'd chosen and who'd chosen him right back. Years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and challenges. Simon grew into a capable young man, eventually meeting a sweet girl from Genoa and starting his own family nearby. Grace, despite her inherited clumsiness, found love with a patient rancher who thought her frequent mishaps were endearing rather than frustrating. She married at 22 in a ceremony that featured a memorable moment when she tripped on her way down the aisle, caught by her grinning father before she could fall. Samuel and Josephine aged together, their hair turning gray, their movements becoming slower but no less sure. They remained in their mountain cabin, occasionally taking in travelers or hunters who needed shelter, sharing the home they'd built with anyone who needed it. Their love story became something of a legend in the area, told and retold about the mountain man who'd let a clumsy girl step on his feet all night long and ended up finding everything he'd never known he needed. On a summer evening in 1897, 30 years after that first barn dance, Samuel and Josephine sat together on their porch watching the sunset once again. They were both 70 now, or close enough, their bodies bearing the marks of lives fully lived. But their hands were still clasped together, fingers intertwined, and when they looked at each other, the love in their eyes was as fresh and real as it had been decades earlier. "Do you remember the barn dance?" Josephine asked. "That first night?" "Every detail," Samuel said. "You wore a dark blue dress and your hair kept falling down from trying to keep up with the music. You apologized every time you stepped on my feet, which was about every 30 seconds. Josephine laughed. "I was so embarrassed. I couldn't believe you kept dancing with me anyway." "Best decision I ever made," Samuel said. "Well, second best. The best was asking you to marry me." "You know what I remember most?" Josephine said. "The way you looked at me that night, not with pity or amusement like everyone else, but with genuine kindness. Like you saw past the clumsiness to who I actually was underneath. No one had ever looked at me like that before." "I saw the real you right away," Samuel said. "The brave, beautiful, stubborn woman who refused to let other people's opinions define her. The woman who could laugh at herself but never gave up. That's who I fell in love with." "And I saw the real you," Josephine countered. "The gentle man hiding behind the rough exterior. The one who cared so much more than he wanted anyone to know. The protector with the soft heart." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the mountains, the wind through the pines, the distant call of an owl. Eventually, from inside the cabin where they were visiting for the week, they heard their grandson, Simon's oldest boy, practicing his fiddle. "He's getting good," Samuel observed. "He is," Josephine agreed. Then, with a mischievous glint in her eye, "Samuel Fletcher, will you dance with me?" Samuel stood, his joints protesting slightly, and extended his hand with mock formality. "Mrs. Fletcher, it would be my absolute pleasure." They danced there on the porch, with no music but the fiddle drifting through the window, and no audience but the mountains themselves. Josephine, true to form, stepped on Samuel's feet within the first few steps. Samuel, true to his nature, didn't complain, just adjusted his movements and kept going. They swayed together in the fading light, two people who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built a life together out of patience and love and the simple choice to see the best in each other. When the music finally stopped and they stood still, breathing heavily from the exertion, Samuel pulled Josephine close and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" Josephine asked. For stepping on my feet that first night," Samuel said. "For being brave enough to dance anyway, even though you knew you'd mess up. For giving me the chance to be the man who caught you when you fell. For all of it, every moment, every day. Thank you for choosing me." "Thank you for letting me," Josephine whispered back. "Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me, when everyone else just saw the clumsy girl who couldn't dance. Thank you for loving me exactly as I am." They held each other as the stars began to appear overhead, as the mountain air grew cooler, as another day ended in the life they'd built together. Inside, their grandson's fiddle started up again, and they could hear voices joining in singing, the sounds of family and love and home. Samuel looked down at his wife, his partner, his best friend for 30 years, and felt complete contentment wash over him. She still couldn't dance without stepping on toes. He still let her step on his all night long. And he wouldn't change a single thing about their extraordinary, beautiful, perfectly imperfect life together. The end came peacefully for both of them, as these things sometimes do for couples who've been together so long they can't imagine existing separately. Samuel passed first on a cold winter morning in 1902, with Josephine holding his hand and their children surrounding them. His last words were a whispered, "I love you," that made Josephine smile even through her tears. She followed him 6 months later, in the summer she'd always loved, with the wildflowers blooming in the mountain meadow where he'd proposed so many decades before. Her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered to say goodbye, sharing stories of the woman who'd never let her clumsiness stop her from living fully, from loving completely, from building a beautiful life in the wild mountains with the man who'd seen her worth when others saw only her faults. They were buried together in a spot overlooking the valley, under the trees Samuel had walked among for so many years, with a simple stone marking their resting place. The inscription read, "Samuel and Josephine Fletcher." He let her step on his feet. She stepped on his heart. Together, they danced through life. And in Genoa, in the towns and settlements scattered through the Sierra Nevada, their story lived on. Parents told it to children, grandparents to grandchildren, a tale of unexpected love and patient devotion, of looking past surface imperfections to see the treasure underneath. It became a reminder that sometimes the best love stories don't start with perfection or grand gestures, but with simple kindness, with the choice to see someone truly, with the willingness to let someone step on your feet all night long because you know they're worth every bruised toe and awkward moment. The barn where they'd first met eventually fell to age and weather, replaced by newer structures, but the story remained. And occasionally, at town dances and celebrations, someone would tell the tale of the mountain man and his clumsy bride, of how they'd found each other in a crowded barn in 1867, of how they'd built a love that lasted a lifetime, of how sometimes the best things in life come not despite our imperfections, but because of them, because they bring us the people patient enough and kind enough to love us exactly as we are.